Tonight's event is the first in a series of talks that have been organized and curated by Nasrin Himada. Nasrin is a Palestinian writer and curator currently based in Kingston, Ontario, on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. Their writing on contemporary art has appeared in many national contemporary art publications, including Canadian Art, C Magazine, Mice, and Fuse. They have collaborated with film festivals and art institutions in Canada and the US, among them the Cissaquasis Institute for Contemporary Art in San Francisco, Trinity Square Video in Toronto, the Leonard and Bina Art Gallery, and the Phi Foundation, both in Montreal. Nasrin's recent project, For Many Returns, typifies their current curatorial interests. The series is designed as a way to explore the possibilities of art writing as a relational act. Since its debut in Montreal, it has toured across Canada, the US, and Europe. From 2019 to 2021, Nasrin held the position of curator at Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. Currently, they hold the position of associate curator at Agnes Etherington Art Center in Kingston. Mercer Union has invited Nasrin to lead a response that extends on the themes found in our current exhibition by Onyeka Igwe, entitled The Real Story is What's in That Room. While the exhibition is currently closed to the public due to provincial guidelines, you can view a walkthrough led by the artist on our website. We're also very excited to have this series organized by Nasrin to accompany the show. There are 2 forthcoming programs scheduled for January 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and again on February 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll put information on both of those events in the chat and hope that you can join us. Please know that we are live captioning each program within this series, including tonight's conversation. I'd like to take a moment to thank our supporters who make our programming possible. Thank you to TD Bank Group for their generous support of Mercer Union's online engagement activities, an initiative that has been vital for us to continue connecting with communities during this time. Onyeka's exhibition is made possible with leading support from the Newton Dime Foundation and with support from the Canada Council for the Arts through the Foreign Artist Tours program. We are grateful to our exhibition partners, British Council and Scotiabank Contact Photography Festival, as well as to Panasonic through their partnership program for cultural institutes. I am so thrilled to welcome Nasrin to Mercer Union. It has been a pleasure and a privilege to work alongside of them and on this series over the last year. Nasrin was instrumental in the commissioning of Onyeka's new work and bringing this project to Canada. We're fortunate to have their insights guiding a response to the show. Please join me in welcoming Nasrin, who will introduce tonight's speakers and share some details on the structure for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. I also want to thank Paul and Nadia and Anique for being here. I know a lot of us are so tired, so I'm very grateful and blessed that we can all sit and listen to Paul and Anique and Nadia tonight. I also want to thank Julia and Amna and everyone at Mercer. It's been so good working with all of you, and I'm so grateful for this collaboration. I wanted to start by saying that this work has been really, Onyeka's film, A So-Called Archive, has been in the works for a couple of years, and it's been really amazing to just live alongside it for a while and to watch it come to fruition. And I'm really excited to be here tonight to feature the artists who are with us tonight and their work alongside Onyeka's. As a guest curator of FORUM, I wanted to invite the artists and writers and curators who are part of this program to think about Onyeka's propositions in her film, A So-Called Archive, as a kind of way to explore material and affective traces of archival architectures. And that is key to, I think, Onyeka's film, is this the resonant feeling that comes off as we're in the buildings and the rooms of these archives. And these architectures tend to what hasn't been recorded, or what has been cataloged, or what is not yet recorded or cataloged, and the stories that are yet to be uncovered. So I feel like there's a kind of conjuring in this film around the hauntings that render a study of the pages and the film reels and the rooms and the structures that contain them and that are still occupied by the shadows of empire. I was really interested in thinking about the archive as image. That's something that is very important for me as a curator and as a writer. And that what I love the most about Onyeka's work and the works and the practices that we're going to hear about tonight is just the way that we are compelled toward archives in very different ways, but that this compulsion or obsession or love or passion kind of brings about a process that conditions images and languages that come to fruition. I think of Onyeka's film alongside these artists' work and their process as a way to, as they constitute other forms of remembering and troubles the ways in which memory is kept or recorded or possessed, and also question the bearing that this has on how we retell our stories. I think I just want to preface this like on a personal note that I've been obsessed with the archive for many years since I learned about the Palestine Film Unit archive. I learned about that archive many years ago, and it is an archive that existed throughout the 60s and 70s in Lebanon that contained more than or thousands and thousands of film reels. And during the 1982 Israeli occupation of Lebanon, that archive was completely disappeared. Throughout the Civil War, the archive was physically moved from it completely disappeared. Remnants of that archive were found in Italy and in other places throughout the years, and some of the films were able to be restored. But I think I was really obsessed with what else was in this archive, or what did it contain? What images are we missing now? And what happened to it? And I think in watching Onyeka's film and in the way that her questioning of how archives even come to be and how they are these living entities in some ways, I really grew more and more to think about the different ways in which this compulsion toward a search for an archive creates these other formations that make it so that that this archive never really disappears or is never lost and is always information. So for me, I think together as some of us, and when I say some of us, I mean the people who come from lineages of dispossession, forced displacement through colonization and occupation and other wars. Together, I think we, through our processes, give language that inform these connections that are felt and then remembered. I think about the visions and the impulses that drive some of us toward this search and that compel us with this obsession, conditioning a sort of collective engagement. And this brings me to the title of this event tonight, The Secret in the Image. And I took that from a line in Anique Jordan's interview with Michelle Pearson-Clark. I'm going to read a little bit of it here. It's published in Momus, but Anique is talking about an exhibition that she has just put together. And she says, I saw this so many times within the show, particularly with a lot of my aunts coming by or a lot of younger women who would notice instantly the style of my hair. And they'd ask, why did you decide to twist it? And I just thought to myself how private that is. Very few people will know to question that or to interpret just a simple thing like how my hair is slightly visible in some of the images and how you can see it coiling down around my ear. I feel that those subtle gestures allow us to have a secret in the image that can't be accessed by other folks. I love this so much because I thought of how important it is to think about these archival intimacies that come out of these photographs, have a kind of unspoken understanding and keep an opacity, which is so important, again, to thinking about the love we have for archives and how we want to create and build them and also protect them in some ways. I also just want to say a little bit about the title of the entire program, which is called Let It Be, Let It Matter What We Call a Thing. And that's a direct line out of a poem by Solmaz Sharif called Look. And in this poem, in her entire poetry book, actually, that's also called Look, she uses terminology from a dictionary that the US Department of Defense put together after 9/11. I'm obsessed with this poem. I go to it all the time for nourishment and inspiration. But what I love about it is the way that Solmaz thinks about language and the way she brings attention to its manipulation in order to serve a violent act. She then catapults the reader toward another vision of a definition that involves giving a body and a face to a loved one by looking at them. For me, in this one poem, is what it does is it lets us be in the process of feeling how language, once changed, changes everything. And I think about that very much in close connection to Onyeka's film, A So-Called Archive, to think about the different ways in which language and images are connected, and to really think about why would it matter to call something an archive or not? And that's something I just is going to kind of really be a running theme for the entire program. I know I'm talking so much, but I'm going to get to introducing the speakers now, and Nadia is going to moderate a conversation with Anique and Paul. So Nadia Kurd is a great friend, someone who I've admired for a very long time, incredible curator who's based in Edmonton, who's the recipient of many grants and awards and has curated exhibitions that have focused on unacknowledged histories, material culture, and emerging artists. She is the curator of the University of Alberta Art Collection. Anique Jordan is one of my favorite artists and writers and curators working in photography and sculpture and performance, often employing ontology theory to challenge historical or dominant narratives and creates impossible images. I love that so much, impossible images. Anique has been a lecturer in the 2017 Canada Seminar Speaker at Harvard University and co-curated the exhibition Every Now Then, Reframing Nationhood at the AGO. She has also exhibited in throughout Canada at the AGO, at the AGYU, at the Art Gallery of Guelph, at Doris McCarthy, the Wedge Collection, at the Art Gallery of Windsor and Gallery 44, and has held residencies at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago and Osgoode Hall Law School. She's also the recipient of the Natishan Emerging Artist Award and the Toronto Arts Foundation Emerging Artist of the Year Award. Paul Seesequasis is a writer and cultural worker, curator, and commentator, currently residing in Saskatoon. He curates the incredible Indigenous archival photo project. If you're on Twitter, you should really follow Paul and follow this project. It is so beautiful. It's online, but it has also manifested in a physical exhibition of archival Indigenous photographs that explores history, identity, and the process of visual reclamation. His photo book, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, was published in 2019, and Gaze, a photobiography of Continental Horn, is his next book, which will be published in the spring of 2022, I guess this year. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Nadia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Nasrin, for your introduction and for bringing us all together this evening. I also want to thank Mercer Union for hosting this event. I'm coming to you from so-called Edmonton, which is in Treaty 6, and I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with Paul and Anique this evening and to really frame our conversation around the work of UK-based artist Onyeka Igwe's multifaceted project, A So-Called Archive, which looks at the architectures and places of archives, a project that I think really brilliantly calls attention to the past, present legacies of colonialism and the production of knowledge. I'm particularly excited because I feel that Anique and Paul really engage in distinct and generative ways to bring to light hidden histories and tell stories, much like Onyeka, and how really, to use Kanisa Lubrin's words, they also, quote, expose the naked vulnerability of archives as an enclosure of domination. So I guess if Paul and Anique want to sort of join us on video, we can start our conversation. Thank you. And I guess probably to start really broadly, I was wondering if the two of you could describe your practice and maybe talk about how you approach archives in your work, and really what are some of the things that inform your practice? I guess let's start with Anique.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Nadia. Thank you, Nasrin, for the beautiful introduction, and to Mercer for having Paul and I here. The exhibition that has been curated and the conversations that are following it sounds so amazing and timely. So I'm really happy to be part of opening that conversation. So did you want us to share slides or to, okay, cool. So I'm gonna just take a couple minutes to just give a bit of a primer on some of my work, starting with the very first set of photographic, performative works that I've done up until the most recent pieces. So I'll share my, only host. I've never been a host on a webinar call. Okay, cool, it works perfectly. Okay, got it. So we'll just start with this. And so I'll just talk a little bit about, I wonder if I can, sorry, maybe if I press play. Okay, cool. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think I have 3 different series of work here. And then it's just really to give you a bit of a sense of what I'm doing for those who've never seen the work that I've been working on for the past 6 or 7 years. And also just to give a bit of a primer on how I think about archives. So this is the first set of work that I've really produced and started thinking about photography connected to performance. And it came from a question that I was asking a lot of women in my family, and many people who are familiar with my work would have heard this story several times. It started from thinking about questions of survival, particularly for Black people across the diaspora. As a kid, I was always really confused by how it is that Black people, particularly across the diaspora, have been able to endure so many different types of interruptions throughout history and through our individual lives, and yet still be able to exist and withstand. And it was a really basic question that I had as a kid, like, how, I don't get it. How's that possible? And so I took a separate route in trying to think through that question. And eventually I was brought to trying to think through the answer of that question by talking to women in my family, particularly asking them the question of survival. So I started interviewing women in my family who are based in Trinidad, and my mom who's in Toronto, but at the time we were in Trinidad, and asking them, how do you survive? And they just started telling me all these stories that I would never have had access to or even think to get into, or it's not something I would have known had I not asked them this really bold and really broad kind of question. And so the stories started to flow out, and I started to document myself in these different locations that their stories were held in. So you'll see, I think I have 3 or 4 images from this series. It's called Salt. And I've named it Salt because I was thinking about the connection to the Atlantic and the ways in which salt is both something that corrodes and yet heals, and the complexities that I wanted to maintain in the ways that I was thinking about these images and thinking about the stories behind it, how we survive, thrive, all that stuff, but yet they're mixed within these complexities of trying to figure things out, trying to to make it through some of like all these different layers of historical interruptions. And so so these are all self-portraits shot in family homes and in places that my mom grew up in, southern Trinidad and San Fernando. So all of these images connect to different locations that connect to my family. This is a pan yard, which is deeply connected to Caribbean, particularly Trinidadian culture. This image was shot at a market. My great grandmother was a market woman who would sell like mangoes that was imported from Grenada. And a lot of these stories I didn't know and didn't have access to until I started asking these questions. And my mom would gradually remember these little bits of information. Other people would remember things, and they would do little actions that they remembered that their grandmother did, or recall certain names that they may not have remembered had we not started talking through this. This is a more recent series I'm going to show you. It's part of a series called Banya Belly, which in Trinidad and in some other parts of the Caribbean, Banya Belly is a phrase that's used to mean, it's literally to band your belly. So initially it was for pregnant mothers who, if your belly is really big and it's like hurting your back, to like hold, to help support you. And eventually it turned into something that meant more to brace yourself, to prepare yourself. And it has a sort of magical, like prophetic kind of connotation to it, where it really means something is happening that you don't know is going to happen, but you have to prepare and brace and get ready for. And so I named it Banya Belly because the entire series of work is dealing with archives that I've collected over the past 15 years that are talking through and recalling, remembering instances of violence that happened to Black people, primarily within the city of Toronto. And for me, I was recalling these instances because they never left my body and they've always been part of my memory, and yet they're cycled out of the news cycle in such a way that people are now able to deny it. And so the first image that I'm showing you here is called Lists, and it's me just sort of writing down the list of all the different pieces of newspaper clippings that I wanted to go out and source. And eventually I just stopped writing them down. I was like, there's too many. This is, it does something to you eventually. This is another image from that series. This is called Malvern. This is the provincial planning document from 1968 to 72. There's actually 2 documents in here that deal with the city planning of the community that I grew up in. We can talk through that if people have questions. And these are 2 documents that are 2 newspaper clippings that are 9 years apart. One is from 2005, one is from 2014. The 2005 clipping, which is in the top left-hand corner, was from what was called the year of the gun, quote unquote, where people are being murdered in the city, as people are often murdered in the city. And the only time the city took notice, and when I'm saying that, I'm talking about counselors and even like the broader public took notice, was when a young white woman named Jane Kriba was murdered on Yonge Street on Boxing Day. And then all of a sudden it became this thing about, oh, we have gun violence, but yet people were dying all along and there wasn't this rallying cry towards preventing gun violence. And then 9 years later, we see a similar grid on a separate newspaper that is asking, why is City Hall so white? And so between these 2 images, there's one white person in the images that are dealing with violence, and in the images that are dealing with power, there's 2, let's say 2 or 3 people who are not white. And so I'll kind of stop there, or maybe I'll just explain this set of work. This is a sculptural series, a monument sort of series that I did of this woman named Clara Ford, who is a Black woman who grew up in the city of Toronto, whose story I just stumbled upon when I was looking through the Toronto archive, or the archives of Toronto, which I had often been doing to try to find stories of Black people. And I remember an archivist, when I told her, I'm just kind of looking. And I remember she said to me, she's like, oh, those stories are rare. It's very difficult to find stories of Black Toronto, particularly deep histories. And so I came upon this woman's story, and She's a woman or a person who walked around with a loaded revolver, wore men's clothing, had jobs that many women couldn't have at the time, performed in an all boys or all men's, all boys at the time chorus, was basically this like badass who was making a life for themselves in ways that made most sense for them, and was eventually accused in 1897 or 95 of murdering a young man from a wealthy white family in the city of Toronto. And she was found not guilty, and it's this whole long story. And eventually it came out where in some of the newspapers, when you go through the archives, she talks about how this man and his friends had always been calling her racial slurs and had sexually assaulted her, or she said intervened, or is that the word she used? Anyways, with her. And the detective said, well, why didn't you say anything? And she said, I'm a poor woman of color, who would believe me? And so I created this monument as a way of believing her, and as a way of talking through the ways that we have to arm ourselves, not necessarily with a gun or whatnot, but like physically arm ourselves, psychically arm ourselves to just be able to move through the world. And so yeah, it's called Arming by Clara. And for me, it was also a way to pay homage to this person who I found in this archive, whose story we hadn't had access to, but whose story actually constantly is playing out today, which is a whole other thing. But yeah, so that's just a bit of a primer on the last little bit of work that I've done, which I was sharing. Oops.
Thank you for that, Anique, and taking us through all of those works. That's pretty great. I guess I'll extend the question to you, Paul, as well. You know, describe your practice and how you sort of approach archives, and really what informs your work and what you look for.
Okay, I'm glad to. Firstly, thank you, Nasrin, Nadia, Anique. It's a pleasure to be here with you and for everyone who's tuned in. Speaking from Treaty 6 here. I think what drew me first, and I really, when I began to work on the issue of indigeneity and the photographic image, I knew the starting point was manifest destiny and the predatory nature of the photography itself, of the camera, because the camera, particularly as manifest destiny swept across the Americas, also coincided with the first mobile cameras that were being used. So the first images you find of Indigenous people are images like Wounded Knee, where there's a mass grave and dead bodies are being thrown into the grave by American soldiers, or you have images of starvation, or you have images of bison herds that have been wiped out. So this is kind of the, it's a starting point in terms of just the image of of Indigenous reality and its relationship to the camera and the settler gaze. And I really, as I began to go further into this, was trying to find a counter story, a sort of wind that would go against that. And to do that was really, my starting point began a decade later with Edward S. Curtis, who was a settler photographer who was given a whole bunch of money by J.P. Morgan to capture the vanishing race mostly in the American West, but also Canadian Northwest and Alaska. And so he, with this money, traveled from reserve to reserve, taking photos of the vanishing race. The photos really vary in terms of their accuracy. Some are valuable in terms of study of dress and attire. Other times, Curtis brought around a suitcase of props. And his gaze was particularly on tradition, on what he viewed as a vanishing culture. He was not interested in how Indigenous people were operating even at that time in the 1890s, or how they were dressed. He wanted them in regalia. He wanted to sort of capture this idea that, the Indigenous experience, the Indigenous image is static. It's stasis. It only exists in the past. It does not exist in the present. And that kind of continuum has, as we know, on a broader political and social spectrum, continues to this day. Let me also see if I can share content here. I want to go to all my photos. Here's my photos. Why aren't you coming up? Select more photos. Okay, here we go. Okay, and done. This photo you see here was taken by a contemporary of Edward Curtis, Geraldine Moody, who was a photographer in Western Canada, again around the turn of the 20th century. And this photograph I selected because for me, it sort of encapsulates the Moody Curtis trope, what they were doing, which was one, to capture this idea of the Indigenous person. And I use the word Indigenous only because there isn't really a better word, because it is what even the word Indigenous does is kind of makes this generic mixture of cultures that are so radically different in language and culture and dress, in land, etc., where they live, etc. So it is a very fraught term, but it's the only term that's kind of understandable right now in terms of doing a broad encapsulation. And what I find interesting with the Geraldine Moody photo is that, and so many photos from this period, and again, this is right after the kind of manifest destiny imagery I was talking about, to this idea of suddenly the settler gaze following, okay, we have these people who are going to disappear, quote unquote, and let's capture their images. So Moody was again within this kind of framework, and she took this photograph of an Inouk woman who she wrote down a kind of phonetic version of her name, which is not accurate. And because it is taken around 1900, it hits that borderline of being able to identify and name who she actually was. And it's obviously a studio portrait. So it fits within what the Western gaze, the colonial gaze, wanted to consume, was just the difference, the idea that the Indigenous image is kind of like an endangered species or a species going extinct. It's something that we need to capture now and frame it within the photography. And that kind of aesthetic approach was not just the photographers, that became the earliest postcards that went out, the earliest images that were seen in Europe, accompanied at the same time the Wild West show that Buffalo Bill was taking across Europe. And of course, that was a recreation of Manifest Destiny and included many Indigenous people who needed the employment. So dressed up in regalia and performed Custer's Last Stand, things like that for European audiences. So the actual genocide of Manifest Destiny within a period of a decade was suddenly a theater, a play. It was no longer something that just recently happened. It was now something that was deemed suitable for the Western gaze. And again, the photography is just another aspect of that. Let me see what else I can share here.
It's kind of interesting. You both mentioned, like, and I want to hold on to this thought. We'll come back to it. You know, the gaze, who's actually looking, and who initially would look at these images that are being presented. But we'll come back.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. And I just want to, I'm going to take a pause so we can go to the next question, but I want to share one more photo. There we go. Which for me is important. This photo was taken by one of the first Indian photographers. I'm going to use the word Indian because he was Native American. Indian photographers, Kaiwa photographer actually, named Horst Pulao. And Horst Pulao began taking photos in the 1920s through to his death in the 1970s. And the Smithsonian recently had a huge, recently in the past decade has had a huge retrospective of his photography. A book, a hardcover book, For the Love of His People, has been published. His photos are now used in courses and studies. But during his time, in his decades of photography, he rarely sold a photo. And partly because the settler gaze did not want photos of Indians taken by Indians. That was not the aesthetic that they wanted. And also Horace Pulao, while he did take some photos of beads and feathers and powwows, he was a photojournalist capturing the community of his time. And why I like this photo and why I think it rings a bell with me is that, and I should explain, this photo was taken in 1930 in Oklahoma, and it's Horace Pulao's brother, family, friends, and they're about to embark on a trip to New York City. So what this does for me, and this is particularly at the time of the reservation system being at its, in terms of passes and everything else, being at its height. It's a time when Indigenous people were being parceled off into these little corrals where they would be kept. And this photo and this image runs exactly contrary to that. We have a group of Kiowa people dressed up in their best with a nice car with Palm Spring, I think, on the bumper. And they're heading off to New York City for a week for a holiday. So it just, for me, it is a photograph of resistance and a rejection of this idea of the stasis and of the tragic trope that was so much of what photography is. And it's one of my favorite photos, and I think it captures an alternate reality, which is much closer to home and much closer to the individual dignity and the collective dignity of the Kiowa Nation at that time. And I'll pause there, Nadia, so we can continue.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for that. And both of you for showcasing, I think, images that are quite dense in terms of content and information. And just to sort of go a little bit along those lines and talk about issues around access and even naming in archives. And Paul, you kind of mentioned this briefly about the naming of the subject in one of the photographs. We know that in many North American and European colonial archives, there are issues not only in the procurement of materials in those archives, but also issues regarding misnaming and misidentifying objects, places, and people. And this often happens at the moment of acquisition. How do you navigate these instances of misnaming, and what do you think is at stake?
It's a very good question, Nadia. A part of the Indigenous Archival Photo Project has been the issue of naming and retrieval of the archival image and the liberation of the archival image, if you will, from collections. So when I began doing this, I did it in a sort of guerrilla way. I did not seek any institution's permission. I would go onto the digitized collections, take them, and then post them on social media. And what began to happen out of that is people from the communities would start to recognize who those people were. And it began this kind of visual reclamation of the actual image. In many cases, as you've mentioned, these collections were not named or they were misnamed. And that, there's a multitude of reasons for that. The one I'm about to share now, let me just put it up here, share content. Hopefully I can do this quicker this time. Photos, manage, select more photos, here we go. Done. Okay. This photo that you see was taken in the mid-1950s by a photojournalist named Rosemary Joliet. She was one of the first women photojournalists in Canada. Photojournalism and photography itself was very white male dominated at the time, as it still is. So Rosemary Joliet was one of the sort of I don't like the word pioneer, but it's one of the pioneers of women being photojournalists. She was not Canadian, interestingly. She came from England, was in Toronto, and Toronto in the 50s was a pretty staid, boring place. So she pretty much wanted to get out of Toronto. She began to travel across the country. And she had a particular interest in visiting reserves and also visiting Inuit communities in the north. So a significant part of her legacy is images of Indigenous people taken by this English woman. But why I think she is of note is that there's a naturalness to her photography. She very much was also interested in women's work, women's dress, how women were. And so I think she was afforded an intimacy, despite being non-native, an intimacy into circles that a male photographer would never be able to achieve then, or perhaps even now. This photo is taken in Edmonton around 1954 to 56. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly. I have it written down somewhere. And it's a group of Indigenous nursing students, most of them being Cree. But this photograph is in the Library and Archives Canada collection. It's one of hundreds of photos they have of Rosemary Joliet, but it was not captioned other than its locale and that they were nursing students. That is not necessarily purposely an oversight by Library and Archives Canada, but her photo collection, which was digitized, is separate from her journals and her notebooks, and not all her journals and notebooks are complete. So those two have not been brought together. So it's just one instance of that archival record being disjointed and not being together. It's not always the photographer who's deliberately doing that. It's often that the way the matter of collection happens. So my point in taking this photo, which I first posted around 5-6 years ago, was to strike a chord and to liberate it, firstly from Library and Archives Canada, and to bring it into the public realm. I posted it on Facebook, and I should explain, while I use social media a lot in my kind of the work I do, I am not in any way a fan of social media. I'm a very private person, so this is my outlet, I guess, to use social media, but it's not it's what I stick to it. I'm not comfortable in any other way with social media. So, but what has surprised me when I posted this on Facebook was we began to get hits, not just people liking the photo, but we began to get names. And by the end of it, we had all but one of these women named. And we also were able to get the prints of these photos from Library and Archives Canada sent to the families. So that idea of liberating the archival image from institution, from a museum, from a gallery, and actually getting it back into a family home on a wall, for me is a progression of this project. It's an act of kind of taking the photo away from just a foreign gaze into an intimacy with the family and with the communities that the photo was taken from. And that's been a big part of what the project has been about. I'll stop there for more. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I guess, Anique, I'll pose the question to you too about, and you also touched upon this in your introduction and in sort of the installation that you created, the monument for the person you found in the Toronto News at the reference library. I wondered if you could talk about issues around misnaming and misidentifying.
Yeah, well, first I want to say I love, Paul, what you're saying about the liberation of the archive. Like, something about that just is exactly the language that I feel like I'm looking for and so excited about, because I'm like torn in two different ways. Like, part of me is we return to the archive because there are so many gems there, right? So many of these things have been taken from our communities that are misinterpreted, that our youth don't have access to and may not have had these records not existed. But at the same time, in doing so, we afford the archive so much authority, more so than the authority of like our stories, the gestures, the secrets, the ways that we move through the world, communicate with each other, the ways that we share things down the lineages of our families. And I'm very much interested in that. I'm interested in the like the title says, like those sort of secrets, those things that remain encoded that perhaps we only have like the slightest hint that this means something, you know, that it's for us. And so part of me is really interested in thinking about the body more, and gestures more, and the ways that those two things come together to give us so much information about ourselves, but resist materiality and can never be owned. It can never be taken, right? Like, and so I think about that all the time. And I think about histories, families, communities where there have been these attempts to rid us of our cultures, to do all these different things to us, and yet we still have so much that has been retained that we're able to share, even if they're just inklings of stories or names that you just, you know, your elder might have like remembered that they kind of heard somebody else saying, some older person saying to them as a child. Like those little moments, those little like I want to say like, I don't know, the like codes or like just like magical like bits of information that we still have access to. I want to put more emphasis and more power into that and into those places, because I think when we return to the archive, and rightfully so, you know, there's a lot there that we need, and that, as Paul said, we need to also liberate from those spaces. But then we continue this project of saying the ways that colonial and European systems of knowledge operate are the prime example of how knowledge needs to be designed, stored, maintained. And it removes all those pieces that are not tangible from being equally as valuable. And so I want to constantly be putting value back into those spaces, because I see, like, you know, I'm Trinidadian, my family's from the Caribbean, and I see how so many youth, and me also growing up in Toronto, like I don't have access to a lot of those stories that young people in Trinidad have access to. But at the same time, a lot of those stories don't actually get kept by them because there's so many, you know, like other things happening or whatever. And so I see so much of that history and those like intangibles just sort of fading away as like our elders die. So I want to think about how we can maintain those, but that it doesn't necessarily have to exist within the same forms that archives have already existed, that have been so violent and have been so inaccurate. What does it look like to shift that completely and to think about, well, actually we have archiving systems and they have been working, right? Mm-hmm. Like these other ways that have been saying yours aren't good enough, that's not how you record things, that's not how you care for a special object. Like I want to just sort of dismantle all of that and think about things differently, because as much as it oftentimes sounds impossible because we're stuck in these ways that the physical archive feels like it's the, you know, the best option or whatever, I still want the space to like imagine and to practice it as being a real possibility. Yeah, because for me, it's all about recognizing that our ways of doing things are important. They hold power. They are correct. They're not in needing of an interpretation through a colonial way of doing things or organizing things. So I'm kind of interested in that, and I think it's a project that, you know, who knows, we can actually really like get to, because it's hard to maintain immaterial things, but I'm drawn to that more than anything.
Yeah, certainly it's an endless, once you start, I think, going into archives and looking at images and hearing the stories, you realize that, yeah, there is quite a lot at stake. And you both pointed out, you know, we have to take a lot of these images and objects and really bring it back to communities so that these stories can be fully told and engage next generations, so that they know their stories, and yet those barriers that the archives can sometimes present are pulled apart. I guess maybe I'll go to, we've all, a lot of my questions I feel like are being answered. So, maybe I'll kind of bring it back to Onyeka's work, and maybe we can think about, she really skillfully collages architectural scenes and sounds to reveal a lot of the power dynamics in the archives, even when they're empty. And both of you also, use different strategies to reveal the nature of archives and the materials that you encounter. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about your process here, and how do you sort of engage more bricks and mortar archive places? We could start from there.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm trying to look at my notes. Like I wrote down some of the answers, or some of the ways I wanted to think about your questions. So how do we approach how we use archives? Yeah. So for me, I just collect things in general, but okay, I'll say this one story. I remember one time my mom, I have cousins that are like European Canadian. And one time they got this Christmas gift that was this book of recipes. And I was so jealous. And I turned to my mom and I was like, Mom, how come I don't have a book of, they got this book of recipes from their grandparents. That's a key point. I was like, Mom, how come we don't have these book of recipes? And my mom looked at me kind of like shocked or something. And she was like, we don't write down our recipes. And it just like dawned on me just like how entangled I am in thinking I must do things in this really particular way. So to answer your question, I do use the archive, like Archives of Toronto Archives, the Reference Library, the Ontario Archives of Canada to a certain extent, and then also archives in Trinidad. But what I also am interested in doing is sort of archiving gestures, because they are, it's difficult, like how, right? And so like I do a lot of that through just like watching and trying to put the gestures in my own body. So like my family, for example, in Trinidad, there's like a syncretic religion called Shouta. It's a Baptist church. It's a mix of African traditional religions and Christianity, how you had to like do Christian things in order to practice your own practices because everything was outlawed. So I would go to that church and watch how they would beat the drums and watch how they would move their bodies, the tones of singing, the types of symbols that would be around the church, because it's not just like a cross, like there's so many things. People cover their hair in long drapery. There's certain colors that you wear at certain days. The burial rituals are super specific, must happen in this particular order. And so I just watch these things and I try to, in a way of like choreography, try to put them in my body, because there's no other way for me to remember things that are gestural, that are intangible, that are felt, right? That are embodied. And so I try to do that. And I try to like create some sort of muscle memory, but those things also fade. So it is a way of like, or there's like I am moving towards trying to understand like how to maintain the types of knowledge that I want to have access to without necessarily having to interpret it into a different way of reading or of seeing things. So just like cooking, returning to Trinidad and realizing how different my body feels and how much more I'm able to recall recipes that I grew up with. And then when I come to Toronto, it's like, okay, let me order Uber Eats. like I can't cook. So like, there's just little things like that that I think are really special and important that we just don't give enough agency to, and say like, this is actually a real thing that's happening. Like remembering how to cook because you're in your traditional territory, or because you're in the land that your mother grew up in, or because you're in the land that your grandparents used to live in, like all those things, just recognizing that being in that different space actually impacts your body differently. I want those intangibles to have this equal footing. And so I'm trying to do that in how I think about archiving. And that's why all of the work that I've done that engages the archive puts myself within the frame. So I'm trying to also be part of like a performance where I am remembering this moment, and therefore hoping that there's something performative that relays this body gesture between myself and the viewer. Lots of different thoughts, who knows if this is all working, but it's an attempt, right? And so, yeah, and I think it's something that's very important and that I don't take lightly.
Yeah, that's interesting. That, yeah, I mean, of course, looking at your work, yes, I do see you there, but yes, that connection of tying you back, and again, yeah, placing yourself within that history too is quite interesting. Yeah, Paul.
I really like what Anique said there, particularly with the importance of place and oral knowledge or community knowledge, and how that it's not something that really can exist within the four walls or the bricks and mortar of an archive, a physical archive. I wanted to share something here. And it just gets back to this idea of navigating the archive and where we're going. Let me just get rid of that. And I'll start off with this. Done. This photo was taken by a photographer named Pamela Harris in 1973 in what was then Spence Bay up in the Canadian Arctic. Pamela Harris was is a feminist photographer. She's done some great work. I had the opportunity to meet her about a month ago, just when we had a little window before everything shut down again, at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And we went through her collection of both contact sheets and photographs. And why I think this is part of an important collection is that Pamela Harris went up there in 1973, twice actually, and through the women's collective that was up in Spence Bay, the Inuit Women's Collective, they built a darkroom. None of the women up there had ever worked in the darkroom before, so Pamela translated the instructions into syllabic. She was there with the women as they learned how to take film, develop film. She told a story, this is analog days, of course, of one of the women was being very excited. And of course, there was these big boxes of paper. She managed to get some support from Kodak at the time. So one woman, she told women, these are the photographic prints. And the woman, yay, and she opened up the box right away. And of course, the paper suddenly turned black, So it's that kind of little stories like that. But what was interesting was this idea of this community and the women themselves developing, not only taking their own photos, pictures, but developing them themselves. And being in a remote community, the amount of time it would take at that time, everyone has smartphones now, but in the 70s, nobody did, of course. To send the film down south, get it developed, was both expensive and took months. So these women, Inuit women, began to take their own photos and develop their own photos. And later on, some white guys from Ottawa were coming into the community to do a study. And of course, one of the guys had a camera and said, I want to take some pictures. And one of the women told him, no, you can't, because we have our own photographers now. So there's this idea of just controlling the image and who gets to take the photos, who gets to take the image. And it's kind of a transition point for me and the project, is this idea of regaining control over the image and regaining control over the archive. I just want to share one more if I can.
Sure.
Manage, select more photos. Go. So what you have now, and this is a Indigenous photographer, Kelly Yuhan, who does a lot of photography, particularly in the North. He does a lot of photo shoots for National Geographic, etc. And he's part of a generation now of Native photographers who have reclaimed the image, are reframing the photographic image of indigeneity and bring it into a contemporary and sovereign process. And for me, that's really an exciting conclusion to the project I'm doing, and this whole taking the camera back, and it just makes a profound difference. So there's this transition period. I had shown you that photograph of Horace Pulau, of the people heading off to New York back in the 1930s. And it's taken almost a century, but we're at a stage now where the Indigenous gaze is controlled by Indigenous people whatever nation we're talking about or whatever continent we're talking about. And it is a challenge, I think, to the still very much patriarchal kind of practice of photography. But it's happening, and I'm really encouraged by that. So it's this idea of just breaking free of the archival image and breaking free of the settler gaze. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great. And we've kind of looped back to talking about the gaze and the importance of sort of subverting that and, really presenting our own stories from our own communities. And then the importance of that. I guess sort of as my final question to you both, really focus on the development of future archives. And I want to get a sense of what your thoughts are on some of the urgent issues that archives and even other institutions, if we could, bring it broadly to museums, galleries, and libraries. What do you think those institutions need to tackle and understand? And what would you like to see happen now or even in the near future?
Well, I mean, when you provided us with those questions and I wrote down my notes, is kind of similar to what I've been saying. Like, I mean, why do museums, libraries, and like official archives have to be the places that hold this information? I just think it's like a silly way that we've been assuming that this is the only places capable of maintaining, like being a keeper of memory, right? Like their roles in communities, there are young people who actively archive on a daily basis through social media who are brilliant at it, who it would be interesting if we, what happens if we put some of that authority that we offer those official places into these people who are doing it so naturally to them and are so connected to their communities who they are archiving. So I'm kind of interested in, like social media has already been doing that. It's this crazy, wild place, but what could happen? What are the possibilities if we are really, and particularly I'm interested in young people, what are the possibilities if we really think about what it is that they're doing? It's like marking this time for us.
Yes, I did ask some really big paragraph type of questions.
No, they're great.
I apologize. Paul.
Well, I agree with everything Anique said, and we're still at a stage. We're not done, I think, with archives yet. There's still a lot of reclamation and returning of objects, returning of images. The whole power structure still needs to be challenged. I know there's been initiatives by different museums on it's up and down. Some are better, some are worse. And Anique knows this. There's a lot of work being done by many people to get objects reclaimed or liberated or properly stored or returned to communities. That's continuing. But what Nick said in terms of technology and social media and where that's going is tremendously exciting. It is sometimes hard to comprehend. But I think there is a new generations coming up. The technology has enabled people who could not afford to take images before to now do it with their phones, as opposed to spending $5,000 on a camera and equipment and lenses, etc. You can now do decent stuff with phones, and I think that gap is going to close over the next number of years. So I'm just very excited by seeing that happen. So on one level, yes, we still have a very entrenched power structure, often unwilling to, but that we need to change. And then we have all this tremendous stuff that's happening outside of what has been the normal museum gallery complex. So I'm positive about that. I'm really happy to have heard the ideas today and to feel a small part of that. So I'm excited by it.
Excellent. Thank you both. I believe, Nasrin, it's time for questions from our audience.
Yeah.
So I will hand that to you, but thank you both for, I think a very interesting and uplifting sort of insights into your work and the possibilities of archives. And so thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, thank you so much. That was really, really beautiful to listen to. I'm just waiting for questions to come in, but I had one of my own, and I wondered if Anique or Paul, you wanted to tell us a little bit about any future projects. I know, Paul, your book is going to come out soon, and Anique, you just had this incredible exhibition up, and I'm not sure if it's still up 3:30. I don't know if you wanted to talk about it or, tell us about your own future plans and projects.
I'll jump in first this time. Gaze Gontanetta Horns, it's kind of a photo journey. She was the first Indigenous model in the early 1960s, and also quite outspoken activist. So it's a photo journey through her life with photos, both in archives and from her own family sources. So it's a really exciting project. It's actually coming out in 23, not 22. Thank goodness, because I'm not nowhere near completed. So there's that, and there's several exhibitions that are underway right now that I have enclosing some snapshots, which will be a look at a first retrospective of a Métis photographer named James Brady, who is also an activist out here in Western Canada. And then I'll be coming east in the spring to do another couple of Indigenous exhibitions. So it's going straight forward, and a few other small projects and essays, and just trying to keep busy.
That's awesome. So cool to hear. Can you post any links later on, or if we can get access to some of those things that you just shared, Paul, that's coming up? So 3:30, it did just recently, it's 3:30 is an exhibition that I curated over the course of 3 years that opened during the height of the pandemic, one of the heights. And it's a multi-site exhibition that was centered around the community that I grew up in East Toronto, Scarborough, and then the neighborhood of Malvern. And it's all, it's three artists I was working with. Kelly Fife Marshall is a filmmaker who did a film, a 3-channel installation called Power, looking at the ways that Black communities have been dealing with I think it was, when did it first, I can't remember when it first opened, but it was right after George Floyd's murder. And so dealing with that in combination with the pandemic, and she was thinking about what does power look like. Erin Jones, who did a massive mural on the outskirts or on the facade of the Malvern Public Library, which is the main hub in the community. And then Ebtina Bang, who did 2 different photographic murals in the front of a high school and one in front of the U of T Scarborough campus. It was a show that is about, it started off being called 330 and being about the ways, like the after school hour and the ways that young people negotiate power within their communities. And then it became something about people in general who have power, who act on the power that they have, but who are constantly told that they don't have any power or they don't have any ability to do so. And so it was just centering on that and being like, actually, no, we've been doing these things. So like, for example, Aaron's, it's on the outskirts of the library. He uses a different type of knowledge cataloging system that he developed that is collaging a series of books that's part of the Rita Cox Black African Caribbean book collection. And he puts them into this collage through this different type of knowledge categorizing process. So it's like all these different things that's just very publicly available. It was really important to me because the Malvern hadn't had access to much public art. And so, so yeah, and it's still, the public pieces are still up. There was an in-gallery piece that's now down. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in, sorry you guys, but there is a comment. Just wanted to express my deep admiration for the work you are doing. I've learned so much. And I think Julia had a question, but I don't see it. I don't know if it's coming in. Maybe in the meantime, did you, Anique or Paul, have any questions for each other?
Paul, you're muted. If you're saying something, it's hard to. I'm a
Sorry about that.
conversation person. It's hard to come with questions.
I forgot I muted it when I was having a drink of water. Sorry. But my only comment would be, because I've just really enjoyed the conversation, and especially having a chance to listen to Anique and her comments, is that at some point in time we all have a chance to meet, maybe in Toronto when times are a bit better over coffee or whatever, and have a discussion. So I look forward to that day.
Yeah. I'm really inspired, Paul, by the by this act of liberating these images from the archives, and like by deliberately posting on social media. And I think it's such a, like, I feel like a lot of institutions are trying to figure out how to do that. And you're like, here, like this, like, you know, and I see that happen so many times, you know, when it's like an image that has been dusty in some gallery or museum, and then it's so precious to so many people. It's like, well, why is it here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so true.
There is going to be one of the last programs of this program is going to be on museum collections, and with Michelle Jakes and Sebastian Deline and Jocelyn Piranin talking about, as curators, being directly having a hand in trying to figure out these questions of exactly how to liberate and also rethink collections in that way. Yeah. I think this is a good note to end on. I'm also like you, Anique. I just like to talk. No question. No, there are no other questions that are coming to mind right now, but I don't know if Nadia, you had any last words or comments.
No, I think you both touched on a lot of urgent issues that are facing, you know, a number of institutions like universities, and how to connect with communities. And, you know, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to bring more people in to have conversations about the dynamics within archives, museums. I think there's a lot at stake. So I thank you both for bringing this together and seeing what you both do in the future. And I hope you keep in touch.
Amazing. All right. Good night, everyone. And I hope to see you next week.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Night. Bye.